my plan here is to start and see if people have any questions, because I know there were 2 hands up when I ended the morning session, and then talk about the differences that are related to the differences that are related to the actual names, Svatantrika and Prasangika, and the argument that this entails some sort of philosophical difference in the form of a reification by the Svatantrika side. So that's a difficult topic, and that's the topic we're facing now. So before we start that, it's like, yes, Mark.
Something you were talking about yesterday, when you were talking about
Sangharakshita, yeah.
The idea of that he believed in the mind being transparent to itself, but Chandrakirti disagreed with that. I wasn't exactly clear what was meant by that.
Okay, so when I referred to, we might be talking about 2 different things. So Sangharakshita was this British person who said, not him.
No.
Shantarakshita. Oh, sorry. Shantarakshita. Okay. All right. Well, there's this, in Sanskrit it's called Sva Samvedana, and in Tibetan it's Rangrik. And Rangrik means self-knowledge, basically. Rangrik. No. So Sva is self, in Sanskrit Sva Samvedana, to have a sense of what's going on with yourself. Okay, so those are the etymologies are. The sense, we all have some idea that we can remember what we've experienced in the past. So in order to posit that, some Buddhists have said, well, we must be able to, when we remember having touched the stove and feeling burned, that it's not just that we're remembering an external object, or an object, right? Because people don't actually believe in external objects. It's not just that we're remembering the object side of the experience, we're remembering the subject side of the experience as well. Okay? So how do we remember the subjective side of a past experience if there was never an observer of that experience? There was an observer of the object, which was the consciousness. But if the consciousness itself, as the observer of the object, is also going to become an object of memory, then something, according to proponents of this, has to be observing that consciousness at that time. Now, of course, if maybe you could say, well, if the person was practicing mindfulness meditation, they could immediately notice in every instant what they experienced in the prior instant, and then 10 years later remember what they noticed. But obviously that's not what's going on. It's something more like that people have a feeling or a sense, or maybe we wish to believe that there's some way in which we're transparent to ourselves, that we, right? Normally we don't even think about this, so it's not posited as something that we naturally hold as a tenet, but it's is posited as a tenet. People who are trying to account for how the mind works. I think in Yogacara you have this idea that so from the mind basis of all, a seed ripens and splits into an object and object aspect and a subject aspect. It's like a single karma that's ripening together. So there's no reason to think about the subject as being at a different time than the object or anything like that, right? They're just like 2 aspects of the same thing. So the idea is that you can observe directly. There's an aspect of the mind, Rangrik, that directly observes the mind itself, has direct perceptual knowledge of the mind itself at the moment the mind is knowing any other object. And that's what allows you to remember the subject side of your experience. So, Chandrakirti refutes this as existing even conventionally. In Yogacara it's posited, and Shantarakshita and the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamikas say that it exists conventionally, but it doesn't exist ultimately. Okay, so, and then, I don't know, it comes to be, this term, Rangrik, comes to, like the term Rik itself, we were talking at breakfast, comes to have like different meanings in different systems. But like, it gets to be a big deal for the mind to know its own nature, right? And so if you already have some built-in base level aspect of your mind that's immediately in direct perception, always knowing what's going on with your mind, then that becomes a resource that people in Tibet start incorporating into their understanding of how Tantra, Dzogchen, and so forth, how these things work, because you have this base level awareness. So Rangrik starts to become something other than just a resource for explaining experience and memory. It becomes something that's like part of the liberative process in some systems. So, Chandrakirti doesn't think that this makes any sense even conventionally. And I don't know, it's not something I've spent a lot of time studying, but the basic idea is like, many times, there are Madhyamika arguments that it's absurd to have the agent and the object be identical. The agents and objects are they're Penzendemba, they depend upon one another. And so this arises in dependence on that. And it's not that they're intrinsically other, but you can't say that there's a self-identical, you can't say that they're the same. And that's essentially what they are saying, that the object and the subject are the same. And so if somebody said, well, no, you need another Rangrik to know the first Rangrik, they're saying, no, it's like, it's the faculty of the mind knowing itself in that moment, which would include knowing itself as the knower and so forth. So that's what they would say to avoid endless regret. And so then they would, we would say, well, a knife can cut bread, but can it cut itself, that same knife, in that same moment? It was like, it would not only have to cut the bread, but at the same time it was cutting the bread. Not even at a different time. It would have to also be cutting itself. And then can an eye see itself at the same time? It's seeing out other things and so forth. Is used to refute the idea. The implication is that if something were able to institute itself without depending on subject-object relationship, then it would have to have its own built-in nature. It would have to naturally exist as a knower, because it didn't exist as a knower in relationship to anything other than itself. You can see where this is going, and it could go in a bad direction from Buddhist philosophical point of view, because in some forms of Hindu philosophy, right, the ultimate is something that's ultimately unknowable and undescribable. But then if you say, okay, but like, what's the best way to talk about it or describe it for our minds? Then they would say Sat Chit Ananda. It's like being, consciousness, and bliss. So this being, consciousness, and bliss, which are, in the closest we can get to thinking about the unthinkable, this is not a consciousness of something. It's not a being that depends upon something. Right? So if you have consciousness that is just self-existent as the ground of being, that is like consciousness in and of itself, right? Not of anything or in relationship to anything. It becomes an ontological foundation. I mean, that's explicitly what it's used for in some Hindu philosophies, right? So Buddhist philosophers Chandrakirti doesn't want to go there. Tsongkhapa doesn't want to go there. I guess, Anyway, does that address that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, Brian.
Actually, referring to the same thing when we think about trying to do single-pointed meditation, and then the introspective awareness of watching to see if the mind is staying on the object. Isn't that the same thing? And
Mhm.
is that one mind, or is that one mind watching the other, as we don't always call a mind one piece?
Well, speaking from experience for a moment, I feel like I'm always like catching what my mind was doing right before, at best. Right, at best. Do you see what I'm saying? We say shashin. Shashin is this like introspective vigilance or something, noticing whether you're staying on the object. And it's not understood that it's necessary. I mean, maybe if you're talking about introspective vigilance in a system that posits self-cognition, autocognition, or this, then maybe they link these. I don't know, but it's clear that all these Buddhist systems are teaching people how to meditate, and part of that involves this factor of introspective vigilance. I'm going with these days, or what did we say used to call it? Vigilance, I guess. Oh, Jimba does metacognition. Metacognition. It's like, I don't know. Anyway, it's cognition of what your mind's doing. So, like if you call it metacognition, it starts to sound like, maybe it's a simultaneous cognition of your own cognition, but it's not. It's like observing. I mean, the moments of mind go by so quickly. It's not. The idea is, we can't even really notice maybe if they're simultaneous or not, right? And it's like maybe it feels like it's simultaneous, but if actually you have a mind that's observing itself in the same instant, then you have that philosophical problem. So anyway, that's what I would say. Maybe the other people have a different answer.
So it has to be in the same instance to reveal.
Yeah. This whole idea of Ramrik, it's not just an ordinary reflective awareness of what's going on with oneself. Okay, we definitely need to develop awareness of what our minds are doing. So it's an issue of whether we have total, immediate, direct transparency in that instant of all of our subjectivity, It's like, do you have introspective vigilance or any other mind that directly observes your own mind as the object in the same moment? And that's something like that. If the mind is observing itself and knowing itself directly, that same mind knows, then you have this idea that something's establishing itself independently from a prasangika point of view. Yeah. Okay, was there something else left over in the morning? Yes.
From yesterday, actually. Yesterday you were saying that the Madhyamikas posit a one-level ontology because everything exists by invitation. And then the moment the Sva-tantrikas posit that something's coming from the side of the object conventionally, how is that not a second-degree ontology? Or am I not understanding this framework? Because it doesn't exist by mere invitation conventionally anymore.
Yeah, but that's not what they're saying. And we're all according to Tsongkhapa now. Okay, so what Svatantrika is saying according to Tsongkhapa is that nothing exists ultimately whatsoever. Everything exists as like an illusion, as we're saying. Okay, so that includes emptiness. Doesn't exist ultimately. There isn't anything that exists ultimately. All Madhyamikas are saying that in their own ways. So that's what I'm saying. Like all Madhyamika has that one level ontology, at least as Tsongkhapa interprets it. Sometimes you read people who seem to have gotten the idea that the ultimate truth is some kind of absolute. And then there could be people who interpret, clearly, for example, if you read, the Jonang, Sherak Yeltsin, Dolpopa, then there's the two truths are related in a very different way, so that the ultimate truth is empty in the sense of being empty of everything else, right? And so I don't know, I would like to say that that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of when I'm talking about a two-level ontology. One thing that stupidly seems to exist but in fact actually doesn't exist at all, and one thing that is absolutely real. So, if you're looking at it from a critical point of view, that seems kind of like you might as well be a Hindu. Do you know what I'm saying? Except that you're saying that this ultimate reality is the Buddha, all the Buddha bodies, all the Buddha powers, all the things that we think, well, obviously the Buddha's factor of patience has to be a conventional truth. No, everything about the Buddha's, everything that we know or can think about Buddha's powers, Buddha's body, Buddha's mind, all of it's posited as ultimate truth, and everything else is conventional truth, and it seems to exist, and ultimate truth is empty of those false conventional truths. So that's what I mean by two-level. So that's called Maha Madhyamaka, Great Madhyamaka, by Sherab Gyaltsen and the Jonambas. And so that's different. And that's, it's hard to, it's hard, I was talking the other day about like this idea of this supersessionary stuff. Like we use the conventional truth that you get to the ultimate truth, and then we use the ultimate truth to get to liberation. I mean, that kind of language is in Chandrakirti and in other texts. And so people can think, oh, well, the conventional truth is not as real or as important as the ultimate truth, right? So then it starts to sound like, or can become like a two-level ontology. But, if you read this, you read Nagarjuna, you don't, and they're all the Madhyamakas are coming off of them. It's like the limit of samsara is the limit of nirvana. The two truths are like are right together. Like two ways of what I keep wanting to say, two ways of looking at this. They aren't really two ways of looking at the same thing because they're not ways of looking. But they're, in some sense, we could say, for each and everything, it has these two ways in which it can be seen. And when it's seen in one way, that's the ultimate truth. And when it's seen, whatever thing it is we're talking about, in the other way, that's the conventional truth. So it's not like the conventional truth is like less existent. That's the best way to put it. It's less real only in the sense that it doesn't exist as it appears. But as far as what I mean is, ontology means like how much kind of existential weight, how much, somebody had a book on the unbearable lightness of being, right? So like how light is the being of things, or how heavy is the being of things? Well, in this system, everything weighs exactly the same. It's not like the Buddha has a more existing-y kind of existence than anything else. Everything exists in the same way as a mere imputation. Okay, does that answer it? Any other questions? Okay. All right, so the names for... I was coming to the last... I think I'm maybe not going to go through the last part of the handout, but just, approach this in a little bit different way. The last piece of evidence that we have is, I phrase it on the handout in the morning, Bhagavad-Gita's insistence on the use of autonomous syllogisms. So this is the one of all these evidences that the most ink is spilled over by far. And it's maybe the most complicated and confusing. And if you go by what Tsongkhapa says himself, it's not the most clear. It's not the clearest. In other words, he doesn't think that it's his strongest proof. He says, in Essence of Eloquence, when he had time to reflect on everything he considered about Bhagavad-Gita and so forth, that his strongest proof was this way in which they tried to refute Yogacara and ended up positing like substantially existent particles that exist conventionally. So that raises a question. It's like, why do we have to have such a complicated argument about something that Tsongkhapa doesn't say is the most important proof of Svatantrika over reification. He points to the clearest evidence being something else. So I think I have an idea about that, which I didn't have before. I think that, first of all, as to be clear, Tsongkhapa clearly believes that Chandrakirti has identified an element of reification, or for the same kind of like tendency to not notice that things have a false appearance of existing by way of their own character conventionally, and that's demonstrated by Bhavaviveka's way of arguing. So that's true. That's why it's on the list of evidence. But the amount of time that Tsongkhapa spends arguing about this, and the amount of could be related to, one, the amount of confusion that it's caused for earlier people who had interpreted Prasangika, and what those misinterpretations were from Tsongkhapa's point of view, and how they were so inimical, totally corrupting of the foundation of what Tsongkhapa was trying to do. And what he wanted to do was to show that Chandrakirti, even though he was like taking Bhavaviveka apart for his use of formal logic, that this was not meant to entail that you couldn't use logic, right? And that he wanted through showing exactly what Chandrakirti was saying about what Bhavaviveka did wrong, to explain it very clearly in a way that would leave room for him to posit syllogisms and arguments, and use valid cognition to establish things through reasoning, and that was something that a prasangika could do and needed to do in order to realize emptiness. Who was it who'd been saying that? Well, that was Bhavaviveka who'd been saying that we can and must use reasoning to get at ultimate, even if it's only this like figurative ultimate, and that's our stepping stone to the ultimate, the real non-dual ultimate. And then Chabat Churgi Senge was the person who said this in Tibet, and he said it as part of a thoroughgoing refutation of Chandrakirti. My point is that the whole idea that you can use logic to prove things and therefore get closer to knowing the ultimate and therefore get closer to liberation seems to be, logic, formal logic and reasoning and argument. It seems to be associated with the Svatantrika side. So when people are identifying with Chandrakirti and Prasangika, they're taking that as meaning we don't need all these formal arguments because we don't really hold any position. Holding any position is a form of reification. We as Prasangikas are beyond that. But this is what he's really after, I think. So Lamrim Chemo, for example, he first, when he explains this, he spends a long time identifying and criticizing earlier Tibetan misinterpretations from his point of view of the Svatantrika Prasangika division. And that goes on for a very, very long time. So, and then he says, okay, this is our interpretation. Spends a little while on that. And then he says how the fact that we have, our criticism, Chandrakirti's and my criticism of Svatantrika, does not contradict or hurt our ability to make logical arguments. Do you see what I'm saying? He's not just here to prove that Bhavaviveka is wrong. He wants to salvage something out of it, which is the ability to use all the not exactly as we're seeing, but he wants to use what other people will see as just the kinds of arguments that Bhavaviveka was making. And he'll say, no, they're not just the kind. They may look like the same kind of arguments, but they're not the same kind of arguments at all. And so this is, anyway, he wants to salvage his ability to do reasoning instead of just saying we don't have any position out of it. That's my idea.
Use reasoning but not syllogisms?
Good try. That's really, you're getting warm. That's not right. But it's like exactly the kind of thing right? That people are thinking is like, well, what was Chandrakirti trying to say? Maybe he's saying we can make arguments but not hold any position. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like that kind of thing. All right. So I want to start by identifying then, because this is my, part of my argument is that he's interested in not just, again, for 7th or 8th time, proving that Bhagavad Gita has this subtle reification, but he wants to show how we can purify logic of the fall that Chandrakirti identified in Bhagavad Gita's process without, it's a baby bathwater cliche, works pretty well there, yeah. It's not like, when people read Chandrakirti, they think that he's getting rid of all reason and logic, or that he uses reason and logic but doesn't actually hold any position, or something like that. And he wants to say, no, you're throwing out too much. we can use reason, we can use logic, we can prove things, we can hold positions. Chandrakirti did, Nagarjuna did, we're going to do it. All that stuff works as long as you understand how to do it without making the mistake that Bhagavad Gita did. So then we have to see what exactly was the mistake that he thinks Bhagavad Gita made. So first I wanted to give you a couple of examples of what he takes to be the wrong position, because they give you a sense of what he's trying to do. Let's see, there's number 2. Oh, there's number, okay. Page 228 in volume 3, second misinterpretation. Some translators who are students of the scholar Jayananda argue that Madhyamikas have no thesis of their own and only set out to refute what other people believe. Don't have any thesis or claim or argument, just refute things that other people believe. So could it be patsap? We're in that neighborhood of the whole liberation, means being free from holding any position whatsoever. And once we free ourselves from the kind of naive realism of thinking these things exist, then we have to free ourselves from the view that they don't exist. And so forth. And then once we can liberate ourselves, and other people with these kinds of statements that we make, they're all for the purpose of freeing people from clinging or grasping after any thesis. Because actually, remember we read in that introduction to Truths Sutra that the ultimate truth is devoid of objects of speech and speech itself, as well as knowledge and consciousness. So how could any thesis or formulation express it? That would be the point of view. Another misinterpretation, just 2 pages after that, is there are many today, in Tsongkhapa's lifetime, that consider themselves prasangika madhyamikas. And what they say this means is that there's nothing to accept, even conventionally, in their own system, neither as regards the ultimate nor as regards the conventional. So in this one, it's not framed as holding a thesis, but it's like that there's nothing at all that you can accept or say from your own point of view. So you can talk and you can say things, but it's only in terms of referencing what the other person's views are. It seems very similar to me, but I think it is. These are variations on the same theme, which is pre-Tsongkhapa readings of Chandrakirti and trying to figure out what he was saying. Okay. So now I want to actually read you what Chandrakirti says, and I'm going to read you a couple of passages so you can get a feeling for how people get into this kinds of complexity. Page 252. Tsongkhapa says, the passages that Chandrakirti has written on these particular points appear to be exceedingly difficult to understand. Right? So, yeah. And when I wrote Introduction to Emptiness, I felt obliged to put in, well, don't worry if you don't understand this. And it's like, I was thinking, well, people aren't, it's very difficult to understand. And, you know, it occurred to me in preparing this list of evidences that suppose you didn't understand it. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to understand it exactly as long as you understand. You could, you know what I'm saying? Couldn't you understand the view correctly without actually understanding all the details of this argument? Maybe. Anyway. So, here's what Chandrakirti says. In the thesis, sound is impermanent. Both the subject and the predicate are construed only in a general sense and not with specific qualifications. So this is Chandrakirti characterizing Bhavaviveka's view. Chandrakirti is telling us what Bhavaviveka says. Saying when we say sound is impermanent, the subject, sound, and the predicate is impermanent, are construed only in a general sense, not with some specific qualifications as to how they're taken from this or that point of view. If they were taken under specific qualifications, then the conventions of inference and what is inferred would cease to exist. For example, if the subject were construed as sound that evolves from the four great elements, then it wouldn't work for the Vaisheshikas. And if it were said to be qualified as sound that's a quality of space, then the subject wouldn't be established for the Buddhists. So when we'd argue with them, if we specified what we think sound is with our particular tenets about it, then we wouldn't be able to start the conversation with the other person, right? So, likewise, when Vaisheshikas advanced the thesis sound is impermanent to the Sankhya opponents, if sound is construed as produced sound, then it would not be established for the Sankhyas. On the other hand, if sound is construed as something that becomes manifest, then it would not be established for the Vaisheshikas. It's like taking two non-Buddhist schools and saying that even these people couldn't argue about themselves. This is what Chandrakirti is saying that Bhavaviveka said. So like, well, in order to have a subject that we can all agree upon, that we're going to argue about, you can't put in a lot of specifications about how that thing exists. You just got to say, mountain. Right? Exactly. Something like that. So that's what Chandrakirti says that Bhavaviveka is saying. Likewise, however, if something like this, however it is placed in an argument, destruction, when qualified as something that requires some cause other than production itself, is not established for Buddhists, whereas qualified as something that is causeless, it would not be established for the other party, the Vaisheshikas. Therefore, just as the subject and the predicate are taken only in a general sense in the above cases, then likewise in the present case of trying to prove that there's no inherently existent production, just as in the present case, what we're talking about is a mere subject, an unqualified subject, and no particular qualifications that's understood, and this will be the commonly appearing subject that we'll argue about. So, the point is that you can't have like an argument unless you all agree exactly what you're talking about and how it's set up to start with. And then if you agree on like that, then you can create an argument that compels another person to change their mind. That's yeah, that's how Chandrakirti summarizes Bhavaviveka's position. And then, so now that that's all clear, what does Chandrakirti say about that position? He says, it's not like that. And instead, so everything, wrong. It's not like that. Instead, it's like this. Insofar as one accepts the refutation of production as the thing that's being proved when we demonstrate that an eye or pot or whatever is not ultimately being produced, the subject, like the eye, breaks down in the face of reality, and therefore it will be argued there would be no commonly appearing subject. Okay, so that's not very easy to understand. Like, what does he mean? And people could read that, like all the people who said they were Prasangikas, they're saying, well, he's saying that there's nothing, because the I doesn't ultimately, in the face of a ultimate mind that knows things truly, there isn't really any such thing as an I. So how are we going to even start to argue about it, right? So maybe we shouldn't be arguing at all. We'll just say some words to them that will help cure them, but we won't really make any claim, because in the face of an ultimate non-dualistic consciousness, there isn't any claim that holds up, right? So therefore, it will be argued that there could be no commonly appearing subject. There isn't any commonly appearing subject between us and the realist that we can argue about, because we understand that the subject breaks down in the face of reality, and they take it that it's established in reality. He, Baba Viveka himself, must accept this because inaccurate consciousnesses and accurate consciousnesses are different. This is the passage that produces a lot of different interpretations and arguments about whether Tsongkhapa had, typo in his text and so forth, which you can. Therefore, when an inaccurate consciousness takes what is non-existent, as in the case of someone with eye disease who sees a falling hair, so he pulls out that same thing about that seeing suchness, seeing the reality of things, is like a person with no eye disease seeing no falling hairs in the place where the person with eye disease sees the falling hairs. When an inaccurate consciousness takes what is non-existent, as in the case of someone with eye disease seeing falling hair, it does not perceive, even to the slightest degree, an object that exists. The object doesn't exist there at all. When an inaccurate consciousness does not reify what is unreal, as in the case of someone without eye disease looking at the imaginary falling hair, it doesn't perceive, even to the slightest degree, objects that are non-existent insofar as they are merely conventional. Right? So he's definitely creating, there's two kinds of minds. There's minds that he's calling, here we have the translation, accurate and inaccurate, erroneous or non-erroneous. There's two kinds of minds. There's the mind that directly, non-dualistically knows reality, in the face of which none of this holds up. And there's this other mind, which is wrong about anything and everything, and takes things to not in a false way, like the person who thinks they're seeing the falling hairs. So he says, then he quotes, this is Chandrakirti, "This is why Nagarjuna himself said in the refutation of objections, if sense perception and so forth could actually perceive something, then there would be something to refute or to prove. But as they do not, I cannot be faulted." So can you imagine people reading that and they're saying, oh, well, this is pretty clear. They don't have any position because all of our sense consciousness are mistaken, right? And, you get this leap over kind of reading. Of course, Tsongkhapa understands what Nagarjuna means if sensory perception and so forth could actually perceive something that, in a way that it actually existed or existed as it appears or something like that. Since inaccurate and accurate consciousnesses are different in this way, inaccurate consciousness cannot exist when accurate consciousness is present. That is, you can't non-dualistically directly see reality at the same time you're having this false appearance of things as inherently existent. One of the things that's about that is it seems to directly imply that you can't have, people reading this will say, well, this is exactly the refutation that Chandrakirti is making of the idea that you can have a conceptual understanding of emptiness. Because he's saying, well, either your mind is accurate or it's inaccurate. If it's so accurate that it knows reality, then it's not going to have an inaccurate appearance of things as existing inherently. Our idea, right, is that when you have a conceptual understanding of emptiness, the thing that you're understanding is a profound reality. But because it's conceptual, there's still another way in which it's. So, that being the case, that inaccurate and accurate can't go together, how could the conventional I, as this is like EYE, like pot, I, there happened to be arguing about an I instead of a table or a pot. Doesn't make it easier for us, but that's what they do. They're arguing about an I. So, how could the conventional I, as the subject of a syllogism, exist for an accurate consciousness? In the face of the mind that knows reality, and which he's calling accurate consciousness here, there isn't any I. I isn't found in the face of this mind. So like, in Sokpa's way would say, well, yeah, but it still exists because it's found by this other mind. But he's saying, yeah, but in the face of an accurate mind, you can't posit an I. Therefore, since there is for this reason, for Bhavaveka, there is no avoiding the fallacies of a non-existent position, a non-existent thesis, a non-existent reason. Because Bhavaveka is acknowledging that things don't ultimately exist. Well, in the face of this ultimate mind, none of the stuff you're arguing about exists anyway. So then how can you claim that you have, something that you're proving to the other person? Okay. So, I wanted to read that too. First of all, you can see how difficult this is and how it could be readily amenable to readings other than the one that J. Rinpoche arrived at. So he spends a long time explaining this, very painstakingly showing why it doesn't mean what one might take it on the surface to imply, which is that we can't really make any argument at all, because there's either there's inaccurate consciousness and then we're all mucking around here, or you're accurate and in the face of that there's nothing that we can talk about. Okay, so having gotten everybody confused, now what I plan to do is to give you an oral commentary on some portions of Chapter 8 of Introduction to Emptiness. Because this is really hard, and this is, I think, where it's explained most clearly. Okay, there are lots of more intricate scholarly explanations of it, but the whole goal of this book was to try to explain everything in the insight portion of Tsongkhapa's Lamrim as clearly as I could. So I'm just going to read a few, read passages out of Chapter 8 and then comment on them. Okay, so first, all Madhyamikas agree that intrinsic nature appears to our senses but cannot be found under ultimate analysis. That speaks to a question that we had in the morning. That you're like, it's not that intrinsic existence can be found under an ultimate analysis. They're saying, well, there's nothing that can be found under ultimate analysis. The question is whether things nonetheless have, at the conventional level, some intrinsic character of their own. Yeah. And the Prasangikas are saying, well, they don't, but if they did, you would find it under ultimate analysis, and you don't. That's what proves that it's not there. And the Svatantrika said, no, that's not right. Intrinsic nature is not findable under ultimate analysis, and nothing is findable under an ultimate analysis. But that doesn't mean that nothing has any character conventionally. You follow? Do you follow? Okay. So all Madhyamikas agree that intrinsic nature appears to our senses, but cannot be found under an ultimate analysis. I'm still on the first sentence. Intrinsic nature appears to our senses. So, this idea that things have some character of their own is appearing at the sense perception level. So conventionally, there's this, appearance of things as red and blue and far and near, right? And they appear to our senses as having quality of blueness, for example, right? And when it appears to have that quality, it appears that that quality is naturally in the object. It doesn't need us to posit it. Now the question is whether that's right or not. It's not a question of whether things can be found under ultimate analysis. They've all agreed about that. When you go and search for, whether things exist in and of themselves, you're not going to find anything. But at the conventional level, this appearance to our senses that things are red or blue from their own side, you could say objectively, Ramrune, from their own side, is that appearance to our senses okay or not? So the Svatantrikas are saying, according to Tsongkhapa, are saying, that's not what we're discrediting. We're discrediting the idea that's the idea that arises in our mind that we grasp at these things as ultimately real, and it's not. It's okay. The raw data of our direct sense perceivers, as long as they're not contaminated by some superficial cause of error, like whirling firebrand and so forth, then what appears to them can be relied upon. You see what I'm saying? Look, remember what I was talking before as saying, well, we have to use reasoning, but we need to have some data to start with. And in Prasangika, we have reliable, in Tsongkhapa's Prasangika, we have reliable data, but it's all contaminated with this false appearance of inherent existence. Well, essentially what he's saying is that in Svatantrika, it's not contaminated. It's true that we're trapped in cyclic existence because we imagine things existing ultimately, and in fact they don't. They exist merely like illusions. But they don't actually appear to our senses in a deceptive way. We have to work with that information to prove that there's no ultimate production or ultimate I or something like that. Okay? So, people and cars exist conventionally, but intrinsic nature does not exist at all. It's not that it exists conventionally. This is according to Chandrakirti, according to Prasangika, according to Tsongkhapa. You have to distinguish between two kinds of things, right, that are being refuted. The idea that people and cars exist ultimately is refuted. But the idea that they have some intrinsic nature doesn't hold up even conventionally. So they exist, but they don't have intrinsic nature even conventionally in the Prasangika way. And so this is why some of the evidence that I was citing earlier, when it looks like Svatantrikas are refuting intrinsic nature, but they put in the world ultimately. It's like, well, you must believe in intrinsic nature conventionally because you keep putting that extra adverb in there. Emptiness means the absence of intrinsic nature. For Prasangika, this means just exactly the same thing. There's another way of talking about the lack of ultimate existence. Because if things did have intrinsic nature, then that nature would be found under ultimate analysis. I already said this before. The impossibility of finding things when you search out how it is that they actually ultimately exist means that they don't have any essential nature in Tsongkhapa's way, yet nonetheless they can exist and function. Okay, so originally, not originally, let's go back to Yeshe De. The first Tibetan doxography or classification of different Indian tenet systems was during the first diffusion by a guy named this isn't in the book, by Yeshe De. And he didn't really know about Prasangika or Chandrakirti, or else he didn't think it was worth mentioning. There were some translations of Chandrakirti texts during the first diffusion, but people didn't, just as I was saying, they weren't paying any attention. So when Yeshe De made up his tenet system, he divided Madhyamikas into the Sautranika Madhyamikas and the Yogacara Madhyamikas. Basically, do the Madhyamikas that accept external objects conventionally and the Madhyamikas that don't accept external objects conventionally. The idea that there's another category for Chandrakirti, doesn't come up because he isn't mentioned. So then, I say originally, this means now by people like Patsap and Jayananda and the people that succeeded them in the 12th century. Madhyamikas were classified as Prasangika or Svatantrika based not on their understanding of emptiness, but on how they used reason to induce an understanding of emptiness. Svatantrikas, such as Bhavaviveka, are those that insist on using autonomous syllogisms, and that's the word Svatantra. Rangyuba are Svatantrikas in Tibetan, which means, people who use autonomous syllogisms. So I'm not telling you this instant what autonomous syllogism means, but this is the idea. In convincing others about emptiness, these people who use autonomous syllogisms insist on arguments that either are or can be converted into positive assertions that are formally correct in terms of Buddhist logic going back to Dignaga. Now, that doesn't tell you the whole story, but that's like part of it. It's like one of the things that Bhavaveka goes off on, Buddhapalita is about, is that he doesn't say, oh, you should never use consequences, contradictory consequences of the other person's view. Now, he says if you're going to use a contradictory consequence, it has to be convertible through switching it around so that it's implicitly stating your actual position. You see? Yeah, that's what Bhavaveka criticizes Buddhapalita. He says, it's not that he uses contradictory consequences, he uses bad ones. Because it's like the example I was given about like the fat Devadatta and if you are actually meaning people to understand that Devadatta is eating in the nighttime, then you can talk about fat Devadatta not eating in the day. But what if you're trying to refute Devadatta, the fat Devadatta, ultimately existing as an eater in nighttime or daytime? Then when you say this fat Devadatta doesn't eat during the day, people will get the wrong idea. This is Bhavaveka's criticism. So like when you give people a contradictory consequence, it has to be reversible so that it converts to what you're actually claiming and not to another thing that you're trying to refute, which is exactly what he's saying that Buddhapalita does. He gives consequences for things being produced from themselves, which a reasonable, common sense person would say, oh, well, obviously that means things are produced from other. He was saying, he doesn't say things are not produced in any way whatsoever because they're not produced in the following ways. And when he gives consequences, you can't flip them around inside out, so they deduce to that. So that's like the one of the big things. I mean, there's a whole subsection of this topic in monastic colleges that deals just with that issue, the reversibility of consequences. So prasangikas such as Chandrakirti, on the other hand, are comfortable with attacking wrong views with contradictory consequences, reductio ad absurdum arguments, if you want to call them. We can use arguments that draw out the contradictions implied by the views of the other person without necessarily implying any specific alternative position. In other words, when we give a contradictory consequence from Chandrakirti's point of view, we don't have to adhere to these rules of formal logic that it has to be a contradictory consequence that implies a formal, correct, positive syllogism. It could just be, a reductio. Okay, so then Tsongkhapa argues that Bhavaveka's insistence on having these autonomous syllogisms that are just formally set up and work by their own, is not just a difference in method, but evidences an underlying difference in the view of emptiness. So let's skip a little. And so we'll consider the background of the argument and then go into the Tsongkhapa's explanation. So the background. Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise opens with a refutation of reified production, a denial that things are ever produced from themselves, from intrinsically existent other things, from both, or without any cause. Buddhapalita explicates Nagarjuna by pointing out the faults of other systems in which each of these positions about production is held. For example, in the case of the non-Buddhist Sankhya philosophers, say that things are, in some sense, produced from themselves because they arise from already existing non-manifest forms of themselves. In response, Buddhapalita gives this argument. It absurdly follows that the production of the same thing over and over again must be endless because, as you say, things arise from themselves. Bhavaveka criticizes this because this reductio cannot be readily converted into a positive assertion that the Madhyamaka will approve because it's, you can't flip it around and establish the correct position. It's interesting that, and I think I was mentioning to somebody, that Buddhapalita merely adds, maybe I said it to everybody, Buddhapalita is just adding in words to what Nagarjuna did and trying to make it clear. He doesn't try to change what Nagarjuna's arguments are. He tries to clarify them. So when Bhavaveka criticizes Buddhapalita, somebody could say, well, isn't he implicitly criticizing Nagarjuna? No, he's not. He's positing, as a commentator's duty, is to posit the thought of the person that he's commenting on, right? And he's positing correctly the thought of Nagarjuna by formulating these logical syllogisms that aren't actually there in Nagarjuna, but one can take as being implied by them. And he's faulting Buddhapalita for failing to do that, instead of just explaining Nagarjuna's argument as he made it. So Chandrakirti criticizes Bhavaveka's use of autonomous syllogisms. He argues that it is proper for Madhyamikas to debate about emptiness using prasangika, just reductio ad absurdum arguments that drawing out contradictions in the other party's position. So let's consider, that's the background of the thing. They're arguing about production. So instead of using this actual example that's they're arguing about with the eye and so forth, I made one up. The table is empty of existing in an ultimate sense because it is a dependent arising. Okay, so that's a syllogism. The table is the subject. The predicate is, that this table is empty of the position, you could say, the thesis is that this table is empty of existing in an ultimate sense, and the reason is because of being a dependent arising. So we could say that the table is the subject, the major premise, which has a special names that aren't major premise in Buddhist logic, but it's the same logical thing. Major premise is whatever is a dependent arising must be empty of existing in an ultimate sense. And the minor premise, which is called the presence of the reason and the subject, is that table is a dependent arising. If table is a dependent arising, whatever is a dependent arising is not produced in an ultimate sense, then, when you should be able to deduce the conclusion or the thesis that table is not produced in an ultimate sense. Okay, that's the idea. So, roughly speaking, Newland says, this kind of direct syllogism is the kind of argument that Bhavaveka is trying to insist on, roughly speaking. And because he thinks that, setting up this kind of argument will have kind of an autonomous force that will compel the other person to accept their view. Because if you're talking about the same thing, that you know exactly what it is because you have the same authority that you're relying upon to know that you're talking about it, and you accept the major premise and the minor premise, and you know what you're talking about there, then it's kind of like that's where the word autonomous comes from. It's like it has a quality of airtightness. Do you see what I'm saying? If we've all agreed on the same exact idea of what it means for something to be there, and we've all agreed that this is that, and we've all agreed that that entails something else, then you're kind of just like, the idea is you're just forced, the other person is just compelled, driven to understand that their position is wrong and the Madhyamika position is right. So our syllogism, in fact, is an argument that Tsongkhapa accepts and that he will advance to people who are ready to understand it. The problem, and this is like, the way I read this anyway, the problem is the insistence on this kind of formulation. Bhavaveka is so dogmatic about it that you have to do it like this, and this is the only way that it's going to make it work. It's unlikely that this kind of argument will be especially persuasive at the outset to somebody who holds exactly the opposite of the thesis. There's somebody who doesn't, believes obviously things are produced, and then you're going to try to get them to be sort of immediately forced in the position that things are not, produced by setting it up this way. Why? Because they take production and ultimately real production as being the same thing. All right. So for them, everything exists as it appears. They take all of their empirical knowledge about the table, which is the subject of the syllogism. It includes a kind of authoritative confirmation that the table exists, and that means inherently exists, because it appears as inherently existent. And so to see it as existent means to see it as inherently existent. Right? They take it as a given that things have their own essential nature, and that on that account they exist in some ultimate sense. So you're like telling someone something that from their point of view makes no sense whatsoever, and then insisting that because you've set the syllogism up in a certain way, they'll be compelled in some sense by the autonomous power of the syllogism to accept it. So Chandrakirti and Buddhapalita say rather than doing this, we should prepare the opponents in some sense by first pointing out contradictory consequences that are attendant to their position. So for example, you could say, things must never change because, as you say, they exist through the power of their own essential nature, not depending on any other circumstances or conditions, right? You could give it as like a contradictory consequence instead of stating your own position directly. So when people see, they know that things, they will come to some conclusion that's contrary to their own, they'll be softened up, essentially, for accepting our thesis. When their certainty about intrinsic nature has been weakened by this kind of argument, Madhyamikas may then have some success in directly stating a thesis to them. No, that means that Tsongkhapa thinks that we do have a thesis, and that we can or could decide to state it to somebody. And it merely conventionally exists, and you can make the argument, and the argument is logical. The problem is why is there this insistence that we have to do it in the form of this syllogism that has some kind of autonomous power from the outset? So Tsongkhapa asks the question, what does it mean that Bhavaviveka, who's a brilliant scholar, he says, in the process of refuting him, right? A brilliant logician, a great Madhyamika, what does it imply that he's unable to appreciate what Buddhapalita is doing here, using the softening up prasanga method instead of directly state? And after all, that's what Nagarjuna did too. So why does he think that it's essential to do it in a different way? So for example, suppose if we all agree to the same, say, 4 premises, but we have maybe a different idea about what conclusion they lead to, then we can make arguments using these common 4 premises that we all agree upon. So in that way, if we all agree on the same set of empirical data, the same set of idea about what our senses are telling us, then we can argue about what conclusions to draw from this common data set. Do you see what I'm saying? But suppose that the other party, while accepting, say, 3 of our 4 premises, has the idea, just takes it as given, that the very same mind that validates the first 3 premises simultaneously confirms the exact opposite of the 4th one. That's actually the situation. You're saying this, people have, with my valid cognition is telling me that things inherently exist and that the chair is sitting there and all these other things, and it's the same valid cognition that's telling me these things. So that's the situation. Madhyamaka is trying to prove to somebody something that is contrary to what they feel they have valid knowledge about. So in this situation, the possibility for a straightforward debate is much more constrained. And we can't just, it seems that it's not going to be an effective means of persuasion to just baldly state, our 4th premise, which is exactly the opposite of what the person takes for granted. This falseness would be obvious to the other party. So Tsongkhapa says this is something that Bhavaviveka, the great logician, must have understood. He couldn't have eluded his understanding of the logician. So Tsongkhapa says that by insisting that we Madhyamikas must prove emptiness by stating an autonomous syllogism directly to the non-Madhyamikas, what is he implying? He's in fact implying that Madhyamikas are debating with non-Madhyamikas from a shared data set, a shared set of understanding about the empirical, the sense data. That is, the Madhyamikas are being read as having the same input that the non-Madhyamikas do, reliable sense data. And that's why we can go directly to stating this autonomous syllogism. You see what I'm saying? So this is what implies that he's not understanding that even at the sensory level, there's this deceptive appearance of things. It would appear then from this that Bhavaviveka must think that the only difference between Madhyamikas and non-Madhyamikas is that the Madhyamikas have analyzed more deeply and worked out the correct implications of the common body of sensory evidence upon which we all agree and which appears to us, correctly. Okay, so now I have my example, which I made up and is not in the text. Suppose there's been a serious traffic accident with personal injuries. We, Madhyamikas, are the prosecution team, arguing for the conviction of the man who caused the accident by running a red light. An eyewitness comes forward to present an impartial account of the accident. I, as the lead prosecutor, know that the witness, while strictly honest, is also completely colorblind. And his testimony about the color of the light at the time of the accident, which is crucial to the case, is simply mistaken because he's colorblind. But as I watch my Madhyamika co-counsel take the lead in the cross-examination, there's something very odd that comes to my attention. He's working doggedly for a conviction, that is proving that these things don't ultimately exist. But his line of questioning does not bring forward or in any way take account of the fact that the witness is completely colorblind. He agrees with me that the accused is guilty. But his mode of argumentation implies that he shares with the defense the implicit assumption that all of the witness's evidence is fully reliable. That's my example. That's so I have to spell out what each thing stands for. The traffic accident represents the disaster of samsara. Trying to get a conviction represents trying to discredit the conception that things exist in an ultimate sense. Is being understood here as the delusion that causes samsara, the traffic accident. The witness represents the testimony of our senses about tables and chairs and so forth. Colorblindness represents the inability to differentiate existence from intrinsic existence. My co-counsel is Bhava Viveka. By the way, I'm Chandrakirti. My co-counsel is Bhava Viveka, who argues for a conviction in a manner, it's like trying to prove to people that things aren't ultimately real. But he argues for this in a manner that implies that he thinks that we have this common data set of sensory information. He argues for his argument implies this implicit but unspoken assumption that's shared with the non-Madhyamika defense team that the honest testimony of our senses must be trusted utterly. Right. So, yeah, that's how I mean, because it's like so hard if you don't have a picture. This makes a picture, right, in your mind. You think of like we're both agreeing that cyclic existence is caused by the false conception that production is ultimately real, and so we're trying to figure out how best to, prove that. And what do we have to work with? We have the evidence of our senses. That's the only raw material we have to work with. Unfortunately, we know that this is contaminated due to habituation of our conception of things as inherently real with the false appearance of things as inherently real at the sensory level. And we may have assumed charitably that our co-counsel understood this, but then they start arguing against ultimate existence in a way that sort of betrays that all along they're assuming that the witness of our senses is fully reliable as to like how things exist. The way this is talked about is in terms of like this idea about what a commonly appearing subject is. Like, so Bhava Viveka is, trying to say that a commonly appearing subject that we're going to argue about is one that we haven't added extra qualifications to that make it impossible for the other person to talk about. But Chandrakirti says that's not what a commonly appearing subject means. You have to have a commonly appearing subject in the system of logic that Bhava Viveka is drawing on. Means that you have a common understanding of how that thing is established. What kind of valid knowledge knows it to be there, right? And so they're saying, well, we can't really have that we don't have a common understanding about what it means to know that something is blue, because for them, the way that you know it's blue is because you have a mind that can certify that it has this character from its own side. Whereas we know perfectly well that that's actually a false appearance. And it's not anything like a valid cognition. Right? And so you don't have, an agreement about a commonly appearing subject in the sense that you have a disagreement about what kind of knowledge is establishing each of the elements, like the reason and the subject and so forth. Right? So this gets us closer to understanding how Tsongkhapa reads Chandrakirti's critique of autonomous syllogisms. The term autonomous syllogisms, svatantra, does not just mean a positive argument that's backed up by valid knowledge of the subject and premise, because if it did, Tsongkhapa would be fine with it. It means arguments of this sort in which the same sort of valid knowledge is being recognized by both parties as having confirmed the subject of the debate and the major and minor premise. So, having sussed out of Chandrakirti's critique of Bhavaveka that this is what's really going on, has a really important value for Tsongkhapa, far beyond just adding one more piece of evidence, right, to the pile that he already has, that Bhavaveka has this subtle reification. Because I was saying at the beginning, this rescues his ability to use logic and to posit syllogisms and to make positive statements and say that this is completely consistent with what Chandrakirti said we should be doing. Many earlier interpretations of Chandrakirti take this critique of Bhavaveka as meaning that Prasangikas never use syllogisms because they don't have any thesis. They just refute the positions of others. Or some people say they don't have any positive thesis. They just have negative claims. Right? Tsongkhapa refutes these views at great length, showing that we use syllogisms. So, for him, this is like a great example of he can immediately quote, right from Nagarjuna and say, if you just read Nagarjuna and stop reading what Bhavaveka says Nagarjuna ought to be saying, it's very clear that he is using syllogisms. He states sometimes this is the thesis and these are the reasons. We make positive assertions. We hold positions that things are empty of an intrinsic existence. Things are dependent arising. And then we argue for those things. And that's the whole point of it. Right? So that's not that we differ, not because we don't have any position or that we don't make any arguments. It's we differ in that all of our arguments are backed up by conventional and valid minds that we at the same time recognize as being mistaken in the sense that objects are falsely appearing to them as conventionally existent. Now, this is the situation, over and over trying to we know that we're colorblind. The testimony of the witness isn't something from the outside. That's talking about our own sense information. So we're trying to deduce that, our senses are wrong using what? Information from our senses. So, because you don't have anything else to start with, right? You have to take that information and analyze and think about it and reason about it in order to see there has to be something wrong here. So if you take this syllogism, the table is empty of intrinsic nature because it's independent arising. If the Prasangika just states this to a person who believes that intrinsic nature is incontrovertibly known by the very same mind that sees the table, then we have the problem, because our disagreement about whether or not things have an intrinsic nature pertains to the accuracy of the raw data of the sense observations, which is the basis from which our whole inferential argument needs to develop. Do you see what I'm saying? So then you can't just say things don't have an intrinsic nature. Well, the person that is what you're talking, if you say table doesn't, as soon as the table is empty of intrinsic nature, well, as soon as you say table, the other person takes it that you mean an intrinsically existent table. So now you've just said an intrinsically existent table doesn't have intrinsic nature. Well, that's not going to be very persuasive. Right? The other person takes it. Valid knowledge of an object entails valid object of that. The other person just takes it that valid knowledge of the object entails valid knowledge of that object's intrinsic nature. And it's because of that situation that we use prasangikas. Not we use reductios. It's not because we don't have any thesis. It's just because it's maybe not effective to directly state them at the outset. And for that reason, it's absurd to insist that that's the way you have to formulate an argument. You would only insist on that if you believed that we had all the same understanding of the data set that we're starting with. So, as Tsongkhapa reads the situation, it's Bhavaveka's rigid stance about the formal workings of logic. Not just the fact that he has syllogisms, but his kind of insistence. It's like, because Tsongkhapa is going to say, yeah, we can do and should use syllogisms, right? And you can also say, well, Bhavaveka could use consequences. So like if Svatantrika and Prasangika don't have actually to do in Tsongkhapa's reading about whether, we only use this kind of argument and they only use that kind of argument. That you can use syllogisms and reductios. What you don't use is an autonomous syllogism, because the word autonomous is taken in the Prasangika to mean that it has its own power to induce or compel understanding in the other party. Why? Because it's airtight. Why is it airtight? Because everybody has this exact understanding of the same data set in all the premises and the subject. It's not airtight in that way from the Prasangika point of view, because, as soon as the table is not inherently existent, the other person hears that as meaning this table bracket that is inherently existent is not inherently existent, right? Doesn't Bhavaveka understand that? No, he must not. Otherwise, he wouldn't be insisting in this way. So, by joining with Chandrakirti and refuting Bhavaveka, Tsongkhapa shows that he can celebrate the power of analysis without straying into a reifying extreme. This is like the claim, and people will say that he was wrong about this, right? But this is the view, is like that we can and must use analysis, not just the way Bhavaveka was saying, but in some ways it bears analogy to it. That is, we want to rescue the role of logic, and we want to rescue the idea of reasoning, and we want to rescue the idea that these minds in the world can make a step forward toward understanding ultimate reality, and that we can actually use non-nirvanic minds to understand or know emptiness conceptually. And, that doesn't imply a reification, because it's all built within an understanding that there's this false appearance. Conventional knowledge is valid, but the accompanying appearance of intrinsic nature is mistaken. Therefore, logic can still work, but some of the traditional rules for why you have to formulate an argument in this particular way don't operate, because they're founded on the assumption that there was the same kind of valid mind that's getting at the intrinsic nature of the object and the reason that are in the debate. So that I'll just have one more thing to say about that, which is my conclusion in this is we're saying, well, what larger lesson can we take from this? I mean, one thing is that I think I've provisionally come to the conclusion that Tsongkhapa doesn't go to all this trouble just to add a 6th or 7th or 8th piece of evidence to the pile. It's not about that. It's because he wants to salvage out of the whole. He wants to salvage thesis holding and syllogism making and reasoning and logic as something that prasangikas can do, which all these other guys, I'm saying the people who were against Chandrakirti and the people who were for him, they all agreed the opposite, that that's not what Chandrakirti was saying. Okay. And so he wants to show that, we can salvage logic if we read Chandrakirti carefully and understand how he's actually indicting Bhavaveka and not read it too superficially. So anyway, the last thing that I took from that is A lot of times, obviously name names, but, it's not just that Tsongkhapa constantly refers in the great treatise to, Hashang Mahayana, who was, according to the story, defeated in debate by Kamalashila at Samye. And so he's not really interested in the history of whether this happened or how exactly it happened. That's not the point. Hashang shows up as mostly like a stock character who represents a point of view. And every time somebody takes something that the Tsongkhapa smells like that point of view, he said, "You're just like Hashang," right? Hashang is, associated with this idea that what we need to do is withdraw our minds from all of these dualistic conceptions, pull back from them into a condition of like this, in terms of so this is the example that is actually toward the end in Lam Chama. He said, well, these people would say, the way we usually do it is like throwing a rock for a dog to chase. Apparently they didn't have balls in Tibet, so their dogs chased rocks. Mm-hmm. So it's like you throw a rock for a dog to chase, and then you go out and try to get the dog and the rock back. That's what we're doing. Like throwing the rock is projecting all these thoughts out and then trying to deal with them out there. So it wouldn't be simpler to just not throw the rock in the first place. Right. So that's the idea of, don't stop making sense. Stop thinking. If all these stupid dualistic thoughts you're having, it's like that's the throwing of the rock. If you would just stop having them, you pull your mind back from them into peace. Become absorbed in a peaceful condition that's prior to the manifestation of all these dualistic thoughts. Why do you throw the rock and then go chasing around after it? Right? That's the the position that's associated with Hashang, and then Tsongkhapa links it to all the other people who say things that to him appear to be quite similar. Right? Now, a lot of these people, on their behalf, do actually use reasoning and logic as part of the path, but they use it as a preliminary step towards getting to some, saying, getting beyond the use of any kind of reasoning at all. So that's kind of what Tsongkhapa is doing in a way too. But we're positing it from our point of view that, from conventional point of view, we can say that this non-dualistic transconceptual understanding has content. It's not just it's just not feeling really good and non-dualistic. But it's a non-dualistic knowledge of some important information. Yeah. That reminded me of something that William James said about religious experience. He said a genuine religious experience is immediately illuminating, morally salutary, and also it delivers some, insight. I'm misquoting, but that's the idea. So he puts these three criteria. Why? Because he wanted to be morally salutary because he didn't want people who just got really high and had Coleridge got really stoned and wrote an amazing poem, right? And so it was yes, but was it morally salutary? It remains. So as long as that was a mystical experience that he had. So James said, that's how we ruled that out. We're not morally salutary. But the point is he also includes, it's not just a matter of having a really, really amazingly good feeling that lights your body up. Then what? Do you know what I'm saying? You have to have something that you take away from it. Tsongkhapa explicitly identifies this with the life story of the Buddha with Udraka and Aradakalama. Saying if it were just enough to get into some really profound, non-dual, peaceful states of mind, and Tsongkhapa would have just stayed with his meditation teachers. Because they already showed him how to get into that. These deep states of samadhi. Really, really deep states of samadhi. He was really good at it. And he left them. Because when he came out of these states, he wasn't any more edified about like the problems than before. So this is why, it's not just enough to withdraw your mind. And the reason I'm talking about that is because some people could say that, if you take what Tsongkhapa is positing as Baba Viveka's view, then the problem is not at the sensory level. The problem is at the conceptual level, right? But in Tsongkhapa's way, even if you say, well, if we just stop thinking, well, any kind of experience, just be here, just be, and don't add any extra thoughts onto this pure experience right now. Are we getting somewhere or not? Do you see what I'm saying? It's I don't know. So we'll just say that sometimes when you hear some Zen teachers, and I'm not saying all, they seem to be saying things that sound just like this. That the problem is that we keep thinking about stuff, and if we could be more like rocks or lizards, that this, sometimes seems to come very close to that, and I know that not all teachers, I know that some Zen teachers explicitly refute that, such as Master Shengyan did. So you could say it was a caricature, except that, I don't know, it's not one that's based on nothing. There seems to be a strain like that's in the tradition. And so people hear that and they pull out that strain because it sounds cool and easier than understanding something. And, more groovy. So, I don't know. The message that I'm distilling, not the one that I don't think this was Tsongkhapa's specific agenda here. I think what he was trying to do was salvage logic and reasoning and syllogisms. But we could take this whole thing as another reminder that in Tsongkhapa's system, that kind of activity of just trying to stop thought is not going to work because we have deeply rooted habituations, and we have even at that moment, as long as our senses are operating, there's already still an ongoing false appearance of things. Are you having some sensation that's arising when you're in this non-conceptual state? Are you taking that sensation as though it were merely imputedly existent? So, okay. I don't know, just to, I don't know, I guess I'll just stop. Yeah, so, question? You understand? Some of you do, I think. Yeah. Yes?
I've been thinking about this this morning, that there doesn't seem to be much. Jeffrey has probably said to us 4 or 6 times in the last few years the power of inferential thought. He's just points to his teacher and says, you can walk through walls, kind of thing. So I think this idea that it never comes across in his arguments that inference has a power on the mind. It just seems like it's this category from the description of the yogis versus the logicians that the yogis have, I have the idea that there's this big pie and everybody has different labels for the experience.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
No, of course, yes, I didn't say that before, but of course, it's clear that Tsongkhapa was a yogi and a logician. And some other things too. I mean, he was amazing, he was an exegetical genius, in the way he was, think of all the people who'd read Chandrakirti, and he takes something out, he shows how it's very reasonable to read this text in a way that's completely different than how people had read it before, and in some ways the opposite. he was a yogi and a logician, and that was the ideal. You know, it's like your yogic practice is founded upon reasoning and not on the absenting of oneself from reasoning. But so this is it's a difficult ideal to live up to, because what's happened a lot of times is that people spend a lot of time studying and not very much time meditating, or then they do the opposite, and then maybe they become critical. Like people will say, you know, oh, those yogis don't understand anything about emptiness, and the yogis are saying those people down in the monastery in the monastic college are just arguing all day about they're just multiplying more conceptual proliferations and never setting their mind in peace. And that's the history of Tibet there.
My other question is, how about the idea of Kamala Shiva taught the meditative stabilization, and that idea is, I don't know when that was elucidated so well. I know he did. So this idea that analysis then supports your meditative stabilization, you know, you get things conjoining.
Yeah,
That seems quite powerful too. Is that
no? I'm glad you brought it
was
up.
there in the early Prasangika kind of idea?
In my opinion, that is exactly correct. When you go into the sections of Lama Chemo where Tsongkhapa is making those arguments about how analysis is integrated into the yogic path, he's not quoting Chandrakirti. He's almost always quoting Kamala Shila, just as you say. And His Holiness has made a point of teaching Kamala Shila's texts, right, publicly. And so let's see, how could we say it? Tsongkhapa has read Chandrakirti in a way that makes room for this, but it's not the emphasis of his text at all, to say the least. And many people have taken it as implying exactly the opposite, right? So when you're going to say, like, well, how are we going to integrate the systematic use of logic into the path? Well, your antecedents are Bhagavad-viveka and Chabachurgi Senge and Kamala Shila. These are the people who've like talked about those things in India and Tibet in a way that's redeployable. Chabachurgi Senge, like, you know, is a hero of this in a certain way, but he's not celebrated much because he was very critical of Chandrakirti. But you have to remember the Chandrakirti he was being critical of and deprecating was the one that, as interpreted by the other people that Tsongkhapa thought were wrong. Also, he's really systematically read Dharmakirti and tried to integrate all kinds of ideas from Dharmakirti and Dignaga into Buddhist logic and Buddhist philosophy. So when we study about what is an affirming negative and non-affirming negative, and what's a specifically characterized phenomenon, generally characterized phenomenon. Of course, these things go back to Dharmakirti, but they come into Tibet and they become first really thought about seriously, and a big effort is made to take this seriously as part of the practice of the path by Chabachurgi Senge. And his reference point for doing this is, of course, not Chandrakirti, because he sees that as cutting exactly the opposite way. He refers to Bhagavad-viveka. So they can see why when I pretended to be Bhagavad-viveka patting Tsongkhapa proudly on the head, it wasn't just some hallucination. It refers to this kind of way in which Tsongkhapa has. He doesn't. If you say he cites Bhagavad-viveka, Tsongkhapa does, as one of the great Madhyamaka masters. And then I think I had that quote from the other day. He was saying, relying on the explanations of Bhagavad-viveka, except where they're a little inaccurate. So, do you know what I'm saying? He wants to be able to draw from Bhagavad-viveka and the other Svatantrika Madhyamakas all the resources that are useful in building a whole system.
Can you talk a little bit more about how people interpret interpreted Chandrakirti from the yogic point of view to reinforce this thing of I mean, were you saying that some people interpreted Chandrakirti as saying just stop all the thinking and as somehow supporting Hoshan?
Well, yeah, for example, Patsop is the person that we're saying most likely first used these two terms, Prasangika and Svatantrika, for two schools, like, before they hadn't been used at all, or if they were used by Chayananda earlier, it was just the word Svatantrika and not as a school. For a long time, we only knew Patsop's views from other people's criticisms of them. But, now actually we have apparently 3 texts by Patsop, and George Dreyfus, read them. And in that book, Moon Shadows, he gives sort of a synopsis of Patsop's views. And they're pretty much the most radically skeptical kind of, it's a very strong form of this position that Tsongkhapa's refuting. His understanding of Chandrakirti is that, being a wise Madhyamaka Buddhist philosopher means not holding to any position whatsoever, either a positive or a negative position. And so then people say, well, aren't you already holding to a position because you're saying that there's no position that's sustainable? And then he says, well, no, I'm not holding to even that position. I'm just saying this to help you. And yeah, and then it keeps, and you think, well, how can you even be a Buddhist or anything if you don't accept anything? It's like, oh, well, he practices. He believes in Buddha. He takes refuge in the 3 jewels. It's just that he thinks that this specifically involves freeing yourself from, what he would see as kind of dogmatic attachment to any position or claim or thesis whatsoever. And there are a lot of other people who are, so his view is very extreme because it doesn't really allow room for any reason at any stage of the path. What it does leave room for is saying things to other people that sound like claims, but you're not actually like holding them at all. You're just, it's situationally, by skill and means, saying things to people that you will help them move towards unsticking themselves. Likewise. And so then that would be an extreme form of this. A less extreme form, many, but still from Tsongkhapa's point of view, being having the same problem, which is we've talked about before, is Koramba, who says, yes, you have to use reason and you can use reason, but this is all provisional, and it's part of the process of eliminating the extremes of saying things exist or saying things that don't exist. You refute both extremes. The extreme that things are real. I'm trying to use not Tsongkhapa vocabulary and qualifiers. You refute the view that things are real, and you refute the view that things are empty. And then you refute the view that they're both, and you refute the view that they're neither. And in that way, you attain kind of an ultimate mind that transcends any kind of mental proliferation. So instead of saying, like we do, that this non-dualistic, non-conceptual state that you attain to is understood from the outside as having this specific content, which is understanding that things are empty in the sense of lacking intrinsic existence. Their view is that, like, the ultimate is one that has to transcend any kind of, identifiable content or claim whatsoever. And that they'll point at Chandrakirti quote after quote where, or even the Shantideva one where he says, the ultimate is not in the domain of the mind. I was like, had that quote in the morning where, it was Prajnaparamati who said, all consciousness is conceptual, all conceptuality is part of ignorance, therefore it implies that any kind of thing that we have is like consciousness of this or consciousness of that is already part of the problem. Yeah. Yes, Brian.
The comment that all awareness has the nature of conceptuality, is that a valid comment?
I have assumed that. Well, first of all, in saying that and trying to talk about it, I've never assumed that it was right. On the face of it, doesn't make any sense to me in terms of how I think about these things. But so I have to think about okay, this is a person who's writing books and practicing Buddhism and is trying from his point of view to be helpful. What the heck is he trying to say, right? And so that's how I understand it, is that consciousness, any kind of consciousness, is because it takes an object and it has a representation of that object, even if it's non-conceptual, what we would call non-conceptual. It has this kind of dualistic quality of representing something and having a subject-object differentiation. So, a long time ago, Jeffrey and I were talking about all these sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Introduction to the Two Truths Sutra that I was quoting this morning. It's all these different Buddhist texts that emphasize so strongly the inconceivability of things. The whole Vimalakirti Nidesha Sutra seems to be about this. It's basically everything, the actual nature of things is so utterly inconceivable. It's all very well and good to articulate this conception of emptiness or this conception of non-duality. It's not that those things are wrong, but they all have to be taken as heuristic, that is some kind of teaching device rather than an established claim. Because the only thing that's actual, ultimately the case is something that can't be talked about at all. And there are so many things in Sutra that say like that. So, and then actually if you think about it, it's not just Buddhism, right? Because then you start looking at, other traditions, and the first line of the Tao Te Ching is the Tao that can be, the path that can be followed is not the true path, or the Tao that can be Tao is not the true Tao. And then, it's just keep going. Hinduism talks about the inconceivability. I was saying that there's something called Nirguna Brahman. That's what I was saying. It's that is the actual ground of being in its purest state, cannot be spoken of or qualified in any way whatsoever. But then, since we have to talk about it, then we say it's being consciousness and bliss, but that's already a step down from the actuality. And you can find Christian theologians saying the same thing. We talk about God as this, that, or another, but that's just how we have to talk. The God, qua God, is something that's not something that we can think about. So, there's different ways to think about this. One that Jeffrey and I were talking about a long time ago is that so much of our experience, and you can see this, and it's one of the Buddhist things, and maybe that comment about, all consciousness is conceptual. So much of our experience has this implicitly dualistic quality. It's just implicitly and continuously dualistic, that there's me and there's you, there's here and there's there's my mind and the object, and then there's all these other differentiations that we're constantly making. And then so there's this constant sense that there's the knower and the known. And so from our point of view, we're trying to make a logical system. We're going to say, well, of course there's a knower and known. You can't have, any kind of knowledge without an interdependent relationship between a subject and an object. Yeah, but the ultimate mind is not like that. Well, what do you mean it's not like that? It's not like that from its own point of view. It's like that from us standing over here watching it, right? So when you get people who are trying to talk about, well, what is the ultimate actually like? They say all kinds of things that don't fit into our system and seem to really make no sense. And because they're trying to speak from the point of view of the inconceivable. Now, you say, well, why do that? I remember George, a long time ago, George Dreyfus, he said to me, well, I think it's, fine that all these other systems, have their way of pointing us towards this experience of nirvana or whatever, this non-dualistic direct realization of the ultimate nature of things. And if they just call it non-dualistic direct realization of the ultimate nature of things, they're not evoking it as it is. We're not, in other words, right? Yeah, so they want to talk in different ways. Fine, as long as they're not actually trying to call it a philosophy. Because of philosophy, you have to articulate a system of distinctions using words and language. You see what I'm saying? And it's like if you're going to build a system that posits a philosophical view, you can't just start from the fact that ultimately everything's indifferentiable and spontaneously effulgent with bliss. You have to say, all right, well, what do we start with? What's the next step? And where are we trying to go? How do we distinguish virtue from non-virtue? Oh, well, they're both equally blissful and empty. It doesn't help, right? Maybe. So, that's the system building point of view. And that's why I was arguing from the beginning, and I started with that quote from R.E. Davis, and you're speaking to barbarians like me, you need to use the kind of language you understand, which is dualistic, right? Conceptual, distinction-based, right? So, on the other hand, maybe you see that as exactly the problem, and you want to evoke, point out, somehow guide people towards some experience that is inconceivable. Then, if you're making distinctions, you have to be undermining them at the same moment as you're doing it, right? I think one time Jeffrey had us read Longchen Rapchan, and I got very, very frustrated because there's so many different words and terms, and as far as I could tell, none of them have definitions that distinguish them from one from the other. I'm like, what does this mean? Well, it means the primordial non-duality of bliss and emptiness. But then what does the next term mean? Something sounds like the same thing. And it's and it's you're not trying to build a system. You're trying to do something else. So how useful is it to build systems is maybe the fundamental question.
Could I ask you this?
Yes.
Point?
Yes.
It says this, Bhavaveka reasons that consciousness is the conventionally existing self because it takes rebirth and appropriates the other aggregates which, together with it, are the basis of designation for the conventionally existing person for the next lifetime.
Yeah, that was...
Can you explain how that works?
I can try. So the way I understand it is that you could say it as Bhavavek is talking out of both sides of his mouth, but A more charitable reading is that he's saying that the person is imputedly existent and designated in relationship to the aggregates, and the person doesn't exist ultimately because he's designated in relation to a collection of the aggregates. But if you say, okay, but what makes it okay conventionally to refer to this collection of aggregates as the person, it's because the consciousness is in there as the thing that at a conventional level makes this collection of aggregates able to function as a person. That's what I would say. So in that way, if you say it like that, you can argue that it's from Bhagavad-Gita's point of view, non-contradictory to say that the person is imputed in relationship to the aggregates, and also to say that by self we mean mind. That's the way I understand it. I'm not positing it, but you can. Do you see why it could be a point of view? It's like, well, okay, let me put it a different way. Just think about how regular, Buddhist talk goes. When you talk about a person is something that we designate in relationship to the aggregates. Yeah, but what's the really important one? What are we going to be leaving behind, and what's moving on? It's like, okay, that's Baba saying, okay, that's why we call it a person, because it's got that part in there. That's the person part of the person. Now the person, it's not that, this is findable ultimately as the essence of the person. He's not going to say that. He's going to say ultimately the person doesn't exist, and that's the whole problem, is we think it does. But why is it conventionally okay to call that a person? Because it has, among this collection of bases of designation, it has something that makes it suitable to call it that. And what is that thing? It's the mind. That's the way I understand it. Flip it around and say, oh, what's a prasangika view? It's like, well, what takes rebirth? The mere I? And it's like, well, what the heck is that? We heard about the mind. What about, which one of the aggregates is the mere I? That wasn't mentioned.
Show me the mere I.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yes, another question. Yes.
I don't get the whole bit with Atisha, where he kind of fell away from what we think of him when I first set that up, and then why Thomas and Copper would attribute the whole
book to him. Yeah.
I think I don't get exactly where he was in the earlier view.
Okay, so I can say something about that. By the way, relevant to that, the only thing that I know really that's specifically relevant to that you might want to read is Betsy Knapper's article in Changing Minds. I mentioned that to you the other day. She wrote an article about, did Tsongkhapa consider himself the founder of a new tradition? Okay, well, it would seem that he's saying no. Or you could say maybe he's saying I'm a reincarnation of Atisha. You know what I'm saying? He's saying he writes his first big book that lays all this stuff out, and he says that the book is written by Atisha. Well, does that mean that he is Atisha? Or does that mean, if we take it more, like the two Bhagavad-Gita's and so forth, maybe one of them thought he was other. Or it could mean that he takes the core insight that structures the book as something that derives from the genius of Atisha. That would not be this issue that we were talking about, but a different one. I'll get to that soon. So I think it's probably something like that. And in the whole beginning of the book, in the beginning of Volume 1, there's really a lot about Atisha. He glorifies Atisha and systematically. It's like, we'll talk about the author of the book, and it's like, well, there's a lot about how great Atisha was in every way, shape, and form. So he wants to link his view to the Gadamba tradition. Say this isn't something that's just started up out of nothing. It's a continuation of this lineage from Atisha, which is a glorious lineage that goes back to India and is founded on the authority of all these Indian Shastras. What in particular does Atisha contribute to the content of the book? So before Tsongkhapa, there was this genre of Tibetan literature known as Denrin, stages of the teaching. And the example that, there are multiple examples, but the one that everybody knows is Jewel Ornament of Liberation by Tsongkhapa. And this book is like Alamrim, but it's a little bit different. It's structured a little bit differently. It doesn't, it has different topics in different order. And what it doesn't have that Lamrim has is this idea of the three capacities of beings. And like, Tsongkhapa really wanted to get across the idea that people, this is reinforced like a lot, you know. What do you do when you get to a more advanced stage of the path? You can tell that you're progressing when you have an interest in going back and doing the earlier practices more deeply. Well, that's not the kind of rhetoric or preference that a lot of practitioners would have. They're saying, well, I'm a very advanced person. I don't need this stupid Hinayana stuff. I'm going to do some Guhya Samaja or something like that, right? Or I'm going to start with Dzogchen as my basic practice from the beginning, right? Because it's the best. How about that as a reason? You know, it's the best. Why am I going to mess with the inferior grade stuff? And he uses Atisha's structure from Lamp for the Path to totally cut against that and strongly emphasize the importance of virtue, wanting to get out of cyclical. You can say how the three principal aspects of the path. It's like, you know, emphasizes the, you know, what do you say, determination to be free, and of course built into this is his emphasis on monasticism too. I mean, he's starting a monastic order. So there's a lot of stuff about Atisha's, you know, vows and keeping his vows pure and so forth. And so, anyway, the short answer is, I think the glory of Atisha is used to, you know, legitimize and put a huge halo around what he's doing. But structurally, the real power that links the two is the concept of that all of the practices that Buddha taught are personal instructions for us. And there's like that you're not supposed to like bypass, you know, the lower things, and that's how the three capacities, you know, is set up, that there's practices that we have in common with, you know, practice. It's not just the lower practices. There's the practices that we have in common with other beings. Bodhisattvas have all these other practices that aren't specifically bodhisattva-ish, but they have them. They're still They're still practices of the bodhisattva. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. I think that was super important for him, and that makes a real difference. You know. I don't know. There's so many. It's hard to figure out, you know, exactly why the Gelugpa order became, you know, so explosively successful that it kind of shaped, you know, being for it or against it shaped the, you know, history of Tibet and intellectual history after that. I mean, but anyway, one of the things that I've thought about is like, people had so many confusions about how to understand the view, and he had such a powerfully convincing, articulate way of expressing this that a lot of people, like, who were great scholars, like, you know, said, "Oh well, I want to sign on to that one," and then the effect of the way in which this view had a way of expressing a profound emptiness, but at the same time giving some, I was going to say oomph, ontological backbone to the idea that that there's a distinction between virtue and non-virtue, and we have to practice that as part of the path. Why? Because conventional knowledge that distinguishes these things. There's conventional knowledge that distinguishes these things, and it's valid and legitimate knowledge. It's not discredited by the ultimate perspective. Well, what does that make possible? It makes it so that you're not going to have, you shouldn't have, in principle, a bunch of people going around saying that because they're advanced yogis, they can do whatever the heck. And was that happening in Tibet? Yes. A lot. And still. Right? That's why the Buddhist teachers, what is that group called? Western Buddhist Teachers Group that sent out that letter. Did you see that?
Yeah, that was in '93. It was just a merely labeled network that didn't last for very long.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Merely labeled network. Well, anyway, so there has to be, promulgation of guidelines about how a teacher should behave. When you see the promulgation of guidelines about how a teacher should behave and should not be exploiting their students and so forth, what does that mean? That means the teachers are exploiting their students. Otherwise, nobody would have to think of making a rule like that. Yeah. It's a general thing that I've learned about like when someone makes a rule, say a tantric vow, do not disparage women. What does that mean? It doesn't just pop up randomly.